7 Signs You're About to Win the Lottery. Real Stories. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the windfall you have been praying for sends its signs ahead of itself, quietly, into the very room you are standing in right now. And if you have ever felt something shift before a single dollar showed up, this teaching is for you. There is an old promise tucked into the book of Malachi, the 3rd chapter, the 10th verse, and it reads like this: "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The windows are already built. They are already hinged. They are already waiting to swing wide. The only question left is whether you are living in the state of consciousness that opens them, or the state that keeps them painted shut. And this is where so many good and sincere people go quietly wrong. They wait for the windfall to prove itself before they will believe in it. When the whole law runs the other direction, the believing opens the window. The window does not open first and hand you the belief afterward. Now let me be clear about something before we go one step further. This is not a teaching about a ticket. It is not a teaching about a lucky number pulled from a drum. The lottery is simply the picture the mind reaches for when it tries to imagine a windfall arriving all at once, out of nowhere, undeserved and unearned. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly how supply behaves when consciousness is ready for it. Sudden, whole, and seemingly out of nowhere, you have been taught that increase comes from luck, from timing, from a stranger's decision. And she taught something almost scandalous by comparison, that the increase already has your name written on it, in what she called the limitless supply. And it is not searching for a lucky number, it is searching for a ready consciousness. So if you have been checking the outer world for proof, and finding none, hear this gently. You were checking the wrong window, and somewhere in you, your number has already been called. Before we walk through the signs together, let us plant one seed in words, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is a creative power. A decree spoken in faith moves the very things it names. So say it with me. I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me, and my word is my wand. Again, I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me, and my word is my wand. And if something in you just went quiet and warm when you said that, type the 2 words God supplies in the comments below. Right now, before you watch another moment, let it be your seal on this teaching. God supplies. The first key is the sign of a strange calm, arriving before the money does. And I want you to notice this one first, because it is the quietest sign and yet the most reliable. When a woman named Ruth came to one of Florence Scovel Shinn's classes, she said she had been anxious about her rent for 3 straight months, staring at the calendar, staring at her bank balance, checking the mailbox with a knot in her stomach, lying awake running the same numbers over and over, as if repeating them enough times might change them. And then one Tuesday morning, nothing about her outer circumstances had changed at all. No letter had come, no call, no sign the outer world had shifted even slightly, and yet the anxiety simply lifted. She said it felt like someone had turned down a loud radio she had gotten so used to, she no longer noticed it was even playing. And only after the quiet arrived did she realize how long she had been living inside that noise. 3 days later, a check arrived that she had completely forgotten she was owed, and she told Florence Scovel Shinn that the strangest part of the whole story was not the check. It was that some part of her had already known, days before, that everything was already all right. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this calm is not a coincidence riding ahead of the miracle. It is the miracle's shadow, falling backward across time, because consciousness always arrives before its evidence. The inner state is the substance, and the outer event is only the shadow it casts afterward. And here is a small everyday picture of the very same thing. Think of a woman standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, staring at a stack of bills on the counter she has stared at every morning for weeks. And then one ordinary morning, nothing different about the light, nothing different about the stack itself. She simply feels lighter looking at it. The tightness in her chest, that always came with that particular view of that particular counter, is simply not there. She cannot explain why. And Florence Scovel Shinn would tell her not to try to explain it, only to trust it, because that lightness is not a mood, it is a message. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of a deeper feeling finally strong enough to override the old one. So this week, notice your own static. Notice the specific worry that plays on repeat in your mind, at the same hour, in the same room, with the same familiar ache, and when you catch it quieting for even 10 minutes without cause, without a single outer thing having changed to explain it, do not brush past it. Do not tell yourself it is only a good mood or a lucky morning. Mark it, thank it, because Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you, that peace which arrives before the proof is the proof. Dressed early, wearing borrowed clothes until the rest of the evidence catches up to it. And it is worth sitting with this a little longer, because so many people wait for calm to be the reward at the end of the story, when in her teaching, it is always the opening line, "It is not the money that produces the peace, it is the peace that clears the very channel the money will later travel through." The two are never in the order the anxious mind assumes, and if you have felt that strange lull lately and wondered what it meant, brushed it aside as simply a good day, or worried that you were only fooling yourself into a false comfort, wonder no longer, and worry no longer either. Your number has already been called somewhere behind that quiet, and it is only waiting for you to stop bracing against it and start walking through it. I bless this calm. It is proof my good is already on its way. The second key is the sign that you stop counting other people's blessings as evidence against your own. This one arrives quieter still, and most people never notice when it happens, because it does not announce itself with fireworks. It simply shows up one ordinary afternoon as the absence of a sting that used to be there without fail. There was a man in one of Florence Scovel Shinn's talks, a salesman named Walter, who used to open the newspaper and feel a small private ache every time he read about someone else's promotion, someone else's inheritance, someone else's lucky break. He told her that every good thing that happened to another person felt like a good thing subtracted from his own pile, as if supply were a single pie being cut into fewer and fewer pieces, and the fewer pieces left, the smaller his own share must surely become. And she told him plainly, that is not how supply behaves at all. Supply is not a pie. It is a river, and a river does not run dry, because your neighbor filled his cup from it. In fact, the very evidence that the river is flowing at all should fill you with more faith, not less, because if it reached him, the channel is open, and an open channel does not close itself off from the very next person standing beside it. So she gave him a small practice. Whenever he read of another person's windfall, he was to say quietly to himself, "If it happened for them, it can happen for me." The river has not stopped moving. And Walter said within weeks the ache was gone. And something stranger happened too. He began to feel a kind of joy, watching other people receive. A joy that used to be laced with envy, and was now simply clean. And it was only a few months after that his own increase arrived, larger than he had asked for. Now let us slow down and look at why this sign carries so much weight. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that envy is a locked door, and generosity of spirit is the key that turns in that very lock. But she also taught something even more searching underneath that. She taught that whatever you begrudge in another, you silently declare to be scarce. And whatever you declare to be scarce, your own consciousness accepts as the law of your own life as well. So when Walter flinched at another man's promotion, he was not simply having an uncharitable moment, he was issuing a quiet decree. Promotions are rare, and rare things do not come to me. And that decree, spoken so softly he never even noticed he was speaking it, was doing more to keep his own good at bay than any outer circumstance ever could. This is why she insisted that rejoicing at another's good fortune is not merely good manners, it is not simply the polite thing to feel, it is active spiritual work. It is you standing at the same river, with your own cup finally uncurled and open instead of clenched shut in comparison. Let me give you an ordinary picture of how this plays out. Because it rarely looks dramatic, it looks like scrolling past a friend's announcement of a new house and feeling your chest tighten just slightly before you even realize why. It looks like hearing a coworker got the raise you quietly wanted and finding your congratulations come out a half-second too late and a half-degree too thin. None of this makes you a bad person. Florence Scovel Shinn would say, it simply makes you a person still standing at the old locked door, not yet aware there was a key in your pocket the whole time. So pause for a moment and think of one person whose recent good fortune has quietly stung you, just one, and silently bless it. Silently say, the same river, the same source, is running toward me even now. And notice what happens in your own body when you say it. Because the moment you can genuinely rejoice at another's increase without a flinch, you have removed one more stone from your own gate. And here is what makes this sign so trustworthy. It never shows up by accident. It only shows up once something in your own consciousness has already begun to loosen its grip on scarcity, which means if you have caught yourself lately feeling glad for someone else's windfall instead of small beside it, that gladness was not sentimental, it was structural. It was the tightness in your own believing finally letting go. It is not that other people's blessings threaten yours. It is that other people's blessings are proof the river is running. And a river that is proven to run does not skip the very next cup held out to receive it. I rejoice at every blessing I see, for the same river flows to me. The third key is the sign that small doors start opening before the big one ever swings wide. And this is the one Florence Scovel Shinn spoke of most tenderly. Because it is so easily missed, people wait for the grand announcement, the enormous check, the single dramatic moment, and while they wait for that, they walk right past the small opening doors that were the actual proof the big one was coming. A woman named Alice told her once that in the weeks before an unexpected sum arrived, 3 small strange conveniences had lined up in a row. A parking space opened right in front of the building she needed on a day she was running late. A bill she thought was due arrived a full week later than expected, giving her breathing room she did not ask for. And a stranger in a shop handed her the exact item she had been quietly wishing for at a steep discount without her saying a word about it. None of these were the windfall itself, but Florence Scovel Shinn taught that they were its outriders, the small couriers sent ahead to say the main event is on its way. She called this the law of visible ease, when your outer life begins loosening its small knots without your straining. That is the surest sign your consciousness has already opened the larger channel. It is not that the small conveniences are unimportant next to the big one. It is that the big one was never going to come without the small ones first, because supply always tests the channel with a trickle before it trusts it with a flood. And there was another student, a young man named Peter, who came to her quite discouraged, certain that nothing was moving in his life at all, and she asked him a simple question, not what has arrived, but what has eased. And when he thought about it honestly, he realized that a long-standing tension with a landlord had softened without explanation. A machine at his work that used to break constantly had suddenly been running smoothly, and a small errand that always took him an hour had somehow taken 10 minutes that very week. He had been so fixed on the absence of the large event that he had completely overlooked the presence of these smaller ones. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him gently that he had been standing in the doorway itself without noticing the door, because he was staring past it towards some larger frame he had decided the good must fill. This is precisely where so many sincere people lose heart. They set their eyes on one specific size of miracle and refuse to recognize its cousins, and so the trickle passes them by entirely unread, like a letter delivered to the right address but never opened. So let this be a gentle correction. The ease does not have to look like the ending you imagine. It does not need to announce itself. It will not arrive wearing a sign that says, "Here is your proof." It will simply feel lighter, smoother, quieter than usual. A line that used to be long moves quickly. A call that used to be difficult goes easily. A decision that used to be agonizing suddenly feels obvious. and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that ease itself is a language. It is consciousness speaking in its own native tongue before the outer world has caught up enough to speak in numbers. So this week, keep a private list. Nothing dramatic, just the small eases, the found parking space, the returned call you did not expect, the little grace that saved you 10 minutes or $10. And when you notice 3 or 4 of these arriving in the same short stretch of days, let your heart quicken just slightly, not with anxious hope, but with quiet recognition, because Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly, the trickle is not separate from the flood, the trickle is the flood, introducing itself politely before it arrives in full, and so the very smallness of the sign is exactly what makes it trustworthy. A counterfeit always needs to be loud to be believed, but the true movement of supply is content to whisper first, knowing the whisper is already doing its work. I welcome every small ease, for it announces the larger good behind it. The fourth key is the sign that your speech changes from begging to claiming. And I want to slow down here, because this is where the whole teaching turns from something you watch for into something you actually do. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is never a neutral thing, it is a wand. Every sentence you speak about money is either building the window or boarding it shut. And most people speak about money the way a beggar speaks at a gate. Please let this work out. I hope this comes through. I need this so badly. And she taught that begging language, however sincere, holds the good at arm's length. Because begging is spoken from the state of lack, and lack can only reproduce more lack. Whatever state you speak from is the state your words go out and gather evidence for. It is not the mouth that decides what arrives. It is the state behind the mouth, and the mouth simply reports what that state already believes. First, consider what begging language sounds like in an ordinary week. A woman checking her account and whispering, "Please let there be enough." A man staring at bills and sighing, "I don't know how I'm going to manage." A mother saying under her breath, "I just hope something comes through soon." None of these people are foolish. They are simply speaking from the old identity, the one that believes itself at the mercy of supply rather than made of the same substance as supply. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this old identity has to be allowed to dissolve, gently, the way frost dissolves off a window in the morning sun. Not because the old self is shameful, but because it was never the true self to begin with. It was only a borrowed coat, worn for a season. And the moment you notice yourself speaking its language, that is not a moment for judgment. It is a moment for a simple substitution. Second, consider what claiming language sounds like instead. Not "please let there be enough," but "there is always enough." Not "I hope this comes through, but this is already arranged and on its way." Not "I don't know how I'll manage, but I am being carried." Supply always finds a way. And notice, claiming language is not denial of the outer facts. The bill is still on the table, but Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness is the first cause and circumstance is only the effect. So speaking the claim is not pretending the effect is different. It is going straight to the cause and adjusting it there. The words are the doorway through which the state behind them finally steps into the open. And she taught that words are seeds, and a seed does not argue with the soil about whether it deserves to grow. It simply falls, and roots, and grows according to its own nature. So when you speak a sentence of lack, even in passing, you have dropped a seed of lack into the soil of your own life, and it will do what seeds do. It will grow, and when you speak a sentence of claim instead, however small it feels, that seed grows too. This is why she taught that idle words are never truly idle. There is no sentence about money that costs you nothing. Everyone is doing quiet work in the dark, whether you are watching it or not. Third, let me tell you about a woman named Dorothy, who came to Florence Scovel Shinn, burdened by a lifetime of small, worn phrases. She had said, "Money doesn't grow on trees" so many times, she said it without even noticing her own voice. She had said, "We can't afford that" to her children. So often, it had become a family song. Everyone hummed without thinking. And Florence Scovel Shinn asked her, "Do you hear what you are decreeing?" Dorothy had thought of her complaints as simply describing reality. And Florence Scovel Shinn told her gently that this is the trap. The old self always insists it is merely describing what is true, when in fact it is continually decreeing what will remain true. So Dorothy began a small practice. Every time the old phrase rose in her throat, she paused and replaced it. Money doesn't grow on trees became money comes to me from expected and unexpected sources. We can't afford that became we choose differently right now, and more is coming. And months later, she said the strangest part was not the money that eventually loosened, though it did. It was how much lighter her whole household felt, as if a tension that had lived in the walls for years had finally been given permission to leave. And there was another woman, a shopkeeper named Miriam, who greeted every customer with the same tired line. Business is so slow this season, never noticing she was standing behind her own counter, decreeing emptiness into the very room she depended on to fill. And when this teaching reached her, she changed only her sentence. Business is flourishing in its own good time, she began to say, even on the slowest afternoons. And within weeks, the words no longer felt forced. They felt simply true, and the shop, she said, began to feel warmer to stand in, before a single new customer had walked through the door. Fourth, consider an ordinary day, laid out hour by hour, so you can see where this sign hides inside your own life. In the morning, a bill notification appears, and the old habit says, there it is again. When is this going to stop? And the claiming habit, spoken quietly, says thank you for this reminder that I am provided for. At midday, a co-worker mentions a promotion, and the old habit says, of course, must be nice. And the claiming habit says, the same river that reached them is reaching me even now. In the afternoon, your savings look smaller than you would like, and the old habit says, this is never going to be enough. And the claiming habit says this is a temporary picture, and not the final one. In the evening, paying for groceries, the old habit tightens the chest and says, I hope this card goes through. And the claiming habit relaxes the shoulders and says, supply always meets me exactly where I stand. And later, lying awake, the old habit runs its quiet tally of everything owed. And the claiming habit interrupts kindly and says, I release this day into the hands that never fail to provide. Nothing in the outer facts changed by force, but the entire emotional architecture of the day changed, hour by hour, sentence by sentence. And that architecture is exactly what consciousness is built from. It is not the size of the claim that matters most, it is the frequency of it. A small claim repeated all day outweighs one grand declaration spoken once and forgotten, which is why she urged her students to treat this not as a single performance, but as a quiet discipline, tended the way a person feeds a small fire a little at a time, all day, so it never goes out. And here is what makes this the fourth sign, rather than merely an exercise. When a person truly lives this way, others start to notice something different in how they speak about money. A friend may say, you sound so calm about all this lately. And when someone else notices the shift in your language before your bank account has caught up, that is a sign, because your inner claiming has already become visible enough to be felt, which means it has already begun rearranging the outer picture behind the scenes. And there is one more layer worth naming, because the old begging self does not usually disappear all at once. It returns in disguise, dressed as caution, dressed as being realistic, whispering that claiming feels foolish when the bank balance says otherwise. And that is simply the old coat, trying to be put back on once more. And you are not required to fight it, only to notice it, and set it down again, as many times as it returns. Because each time you set it down, the true self underneath stands a little more fully in its own light. So pause for a moment right now, and pick one real sentence you have caught yourself saying about money this past week. Just one, and quietly reword it into a claim, not a hope, a claim, and speak it once, right now, in your own voice. Because the old self loosens its hold one sentence at a time, and the new self, the one supply has been waiting for all along, steps forward the very moment you give it your voice to speak with. My words no longer beg, they claim, and my claim is already answered. The fifth key is the sign that you stop designing the delivery route. And I want you to feel the weight of this one slowly, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most people's prayers are really instructions given to the very power they claim to be trusting. They do not simply ask for the good, they specify exactly which truck it must arrive on, exactly which hour, exactly which person must be the one to hand it over. And then when the good tries to come by some other road entirely, they miss it completely because they were staring so hard down the one path they had decided was the only acceptable one. A young man once told her he needed money desperately and had been praying only that a particular business deal would close. When the deal fell through, he was devastated, certain his prayer had failed him, and only weeks later did he realize that in that very same window of time, an old debt he had forgotten about entirely was quietly repaid to him from a completely different direction. The supply had arrived, right on schedule, just not through the door he had nailed shut with his own detailed instructions. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is one of the gentlest tricks the limitless supply plays on a struggling mind. It insists on coming exactly when it is needed, but it will not be bullied into coming exactly how the mind demands. Consider a woman named Grace, who prayed faithfully every night for a raise at her job, certain that was the only door through which her increase could ever walk. And week after week she watched that particular door stay shut, growing more anxious each time her employer passed her over. And it was only when she finally exhausted herself of gripping that single outcome, when she said, quietly and almost in surrender, "I no longer care which way it comes, I only trust that it comes," that a distant cousin she had not spoken to in years left her a small inheritance that dwarfed the raise she had been begging for. Florence Scovel Shinn would say, Grace had not been denied. She had simply been standing at the wrong window with her eyes fixed shut against every other one. So this fifth sign asks something quiet of you. Notice this week, whenever you catch yourself insisting the good must come from this one job, this one person, this one deal, and gently loosen your grip there, not because the specific hope is wrong, but because the specific route is never yours to dictate. The river does not consult the mind for directions. It simply knows where the sea is, and when you feel yourself no longer gripping the exact how, no longer needing it to be this door or that hand, and instead feeling a loose, open confidence that it will arrive, somehow, through whichever door proves easiest for it, that loosening is not carelessness. It is trust finally maturing into wisdom. And if you have caught yourself lately saying something as simple as, "I do not know how this is going to work out, but I know that it will," treasure that sentence, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught, it is one of the most reliable signs there is that the map has already been released into hands wiser than your own. I release the how, and I trust the way that is already arranged. The sixth key is the sign that old debts and old fears begin to loosen their grip, and this is a deeper sign than it first appears, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that fear is simply faith turned upside down. It is belief pointed at the wrong outcome. And every dollar of debt, or every worry about lack, carries an emotional charge that has to discharge before the new supply has anywhere clean to land. Think of fear the way you would think of a fist, clenched so long the fingers forget they were ever meant to open. The money cannot be placed into a hand like that, not because the universe is withholding it, but because the hand itself has no room left to receive. So before the windfall can arrive in the outer world, something has to happen first in the inner one. The grip has to loosen, quietly, often without your even noticing it is happening. There was a man named Thomas who carried an old debt for nearly 6 years, and every single night before sleep he would run the number in his head, over and over, until it sat on his chest like a stone he carried to bed with him. And then one ordinary Sunday, for no outer reason at all, he noticed the number simply was not there when he lay down. He actually sat up, startled, checking his own mind the way you might check a pocket for keys. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him gently that he had not forgotten anything. He had finally set it down. And the setting down was not a symptom of the debt being handled. It was the first quiet motion of the debt actually being handled. Weeks before the outer resolution arrived, so many people wait for the relief to follow the resolution, when she taught it plainly the other way around. The relief is not the reward for the debt being cleared. The relief is the clearing, already underway, working outward the way warmth spreads through a cold room long before you can see any single object visibly change. Now consider this from a second angle. Because fear rarely announces itself as fear, it disguises itself as caution, as simply being realistic. A woman checking her balance 5 times a day does not think of herself as afraid. She thinks of herself as careful, and yet this compulsive checking is itself the fear speaking, dressed in a very respectable coat. So this week notice not only the obvious fears, but the quiet compulsive ones, the checking, the rechecking, the mental replaying of a number, and when you catch yourself in it, do not scold yourself, simply notice how tightly wound it is, because that tightness is the very thing that has to soften before the channel opens. And consider a third angle still, because sometimes what loosens first has nothing to do with money directly at all. Sometimes it is an old grudge, a resentment carried for years towards someone tangled up with money in your past, a parent who mishandled it, a partner who mismanaged it, a boss who withheld what was owed. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that resentment is one of the tightest knots consciousness can tie around its own supply, tighter even than fear itself, because fear at least admits it wants something. Resentment simply refuses to let the old wound close. So if forgiveness toward that person rises up in you unbidden lately, quietly, almost without your permission, treat that softening as one of this sign's truest cousins, because the untying of that particular knot frees channels you did not even know were connected to your supply. This is why she would sometimes tell a student, praying only about money, to instead go and forgive a person from years ago they had never once mentioned, because she could see the knot was tied there, not in the ledger at all. Let me give you a second small story, because fear does not always look like a debt or a grudge. Sometimes it looks like a drawer. There was a woman named Marion who kept every unpaid bill she had ever received in a single drawer in her kitchen, unopened, stacked one on top of another. Because looking at them made her stomach turn, she even moved her coffee cups to the other side of the counter just to avoid standing near it each morning. And Florence Scovel Shinn asked her a simple question. What do you suppose you are keeping alive in that drawer? And Marion had no answer at first. But months later, after she had finally opened the drawer, sorted what needed sorting, paid what could be paid, and let go of what could not yet be resolved, she said the whole kitchen felt different, lighter, as though a low hum she had lived with for years had simply switched off. And it was only after that quiet switching off that an old client finally settled an account owed to her for a very long time. The drawer was never really about the paper inside it. It was a small shrine Marion had built to her own fear, tended daily, fed by avoidance, and the moment she stopped feeding it, the fear had nowhere left to live, and a fear with nowhere left to live simply leaves. So here is a small practice to carry this key honestly into your week, each night, for just a few quiet minutes. Notice whatever fear or old grudge surfaces most easily in your mind, and instead of pushing it away, simply say to it, "You may go now. I release you, and I let the debt go with you." And then let your body actually soften. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench, because the body often knows the release before the mind fully believes it. And if you notice, even for one single night, that the old fear does not come, that the 3 in the morning tightness does not arrive, that the bill sits on the table without your stomach dropping the way it once did, do not call that an ordinary good day. It is a door swinging quietly open in a hallway you have not yet had the courage to walk down, and the debt whose grip is loosening tonight is only the visible edge of a much larger loosening already moving through you, one that reaches further than you can presently see, and touches doors you have not even noticed are locked. I release every old fear, and I let it take the debt with it as it goes. The 7th key is the sign that a sudden generosity rises up in you before the increase even lands. And I want to unfold this one slowly, in several pieces, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that of every sign on this list, this is the one most consistently reported by people right before a windfall, and yet it is the one almost no one expects, and almost no one trusts when it arrives. First, consider what this actually looks like in an ordinary week. You are not wealthy yet. Nothing dramatic has arrived. The account still shows what it showed yesterday, and yet you find yourself wanting to pay for a stranger's coffee, wanting to slip an extra bill into a tip, wanting to give more generously at a moment when logic would say, hold tight, guard what you have, count every dollar twice. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this rising generosity is never foolishness. It is never carelessness wearing a kind face. It is the truest possible evidence that your consciousness has already tasted its own abundance ahead of your bank statement. Because a person who genuinely believes themselves poor clutches, the hand curls into a fist without being told to, and a person who has begun to feel, even faintly, the truth of their own limitless supply opens their hand before they have even decided to. The hand opens before the proof arrives, because the hand was never waiting on the proof to begin with. It was only ever waiting on the belief. It is not the money that loosens the hand. It is the loosened hand that the money is already moving toward, and it is worth pausing on that reversal a moment longer, because almost everyone alive has been taught the exact opposite order. They were taught, wait until you can afford it, wait until you have some to spare, wait until the number is comfortable, and only then will generosity be safe. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this waiting is precisely what keeps so many sincere people standing outside a door that would open the instant they reached for it. It is not safety that produces generosity. It is generosity, however small, that produces the very safety the mind was waiting to feel. Second, consider the story of a man named Harold, who came to one of her lectures deeply in debt, behind on payments he did not know how to catch up on, and yet in the very week before an unexpected sum arrived to clear that debt entirely, he found himself, almost against his own better judgment, buying a coat for a man he saw shivering outside a shop window on a cold evening. He told her afterward that it made no sense at all. He could barely cover his own rent that month. He had walked past that same corner a dozen times before without a second thought, and yet on this particular evening, something in him simply moved before his mind could talk him out of it. And giving that coat away felt like the most natural thing he had done in years. Not a strain, not a sacrifice, not even really a decision, simply an overflow. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him afterward that he had misunderstood his own gesture entirely. He thought he had given from scarcity and taken a foolish risk with money he did not have to spare, but in truth he had given from a place inside himself that already knew it was rich, a place his outer circumstances had not yet caught up to, and that knowing, however brief, however small the gesture looked from the outside, was the exact crack through which the larger supply then poured only days later, because giving from true generosity, not strain, not obligation, not the desperate hope of some cosmic reward waiting on the other side of the ledger, but simple, honest overflow, is one of the most powerful acts of faith a person can perform. It says with the body what the mouth may not yet fully believe, that there is more than enough. And it says it before a single outer fact has changed to justify saying it. Third, consider a second small story, because one story alone can feel like an exception rather than a law. A woman named Edith once told Florence Scovel Shinn that on the very morning before a long overdue payment finally reached her, she had felt a strange pull to leave a large tip for a young waiter who seemed exhausted and discouraged, far more than the meal called for, far more than her own budget that week comfortably allowed, and she said she almost put the bill back in her purse twice, telling herself it was impractical, and then left it anyway, because something in her simply wanted to, not from guilt, not from performance, but from a kind of quiet fullness she could not entirely explain. And when the payment arrived 2 days later, she said she understood immediately what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that the outer world is only ever a mirror catching up to the inner one. The tip did not earn the payment. The tip and the payment were both effects of the very same cause. A consciousness that had, if only for a moment, remembered its own richness. And this is worth naming plainly. It is not the giving that causes the receiving, as though heaven kept a ledger of good deeds owed and paid. It is that the giving and the receiving are two branches of the very same root. and a root that has begun to feed one branch has already begun feeding the other, whether the eye can see it yet or not. Fourth, consider why this works the way it does at the deepest level. And here Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching goes to its very root. She taught that the universe, or what she called the divine mind, mirrors back to us the exact state we hold. If we hold tightness, we receive a tightened world. If we hold a genuine, unforced generosity, we receive a world that answers in kind. And this is not a transaction. It is not a bribe paid to heaven in exchange for a favor. That would only be a subtler form of begging, dressed up in the costume of giving, still whispering please underneath its generosity, still counting what it expects in return. The giving this sign describes has no calculation in it at all. It does not think about what it will get back. It simply moves because something true in you has already remembered what it actually is. And this is precisely why it functions as such a reliable sign rather than a technique you could fake your way into. Because a person cannot manufacture this kind of giving on command the way you might force a smile for a photograph. You cannot sit down and decide, today I will feel a spontaneous overflow. The very trying would prove its absence, which means when it arises in you unbidden, quietly surprising even yourself, catching you a little off guard in the middle of an ordinary errand, it did not come from your effort, it came from a shift that already occurred underneath your effort, down in the deeper waters of your consciousness, where the real decisions are made, long before they surface, and that shift is precisely the one that precedes an increase. It is not the giving that causes the receiving, as though heaven were keeping a ledger of good deeds. It is that both the giving and the receiving are two branches growing from the very same root, and when one branch is already blossoming, you can be certain the other is not far behind. Fifth, let me walk you through an ordinary day, hour by hour, so you can see exactly how quietly this sign hides inside a life that looks, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. In the early morning, standing in line for coffee, a thought passes through you to cover the order of the stranger behind you, and the old habit says, do not be silly, you have your own bills to think about. And yet, something softer in you goes ahead and does it anyway. And you walk out feeling strangely light, as though you were the one who had been given something rather than the one who gave it. At midday, a co-worker mentions they are short for lunch, and instead of the usual quick calculation of what you can spare, you find yourself offering without even finishing the thought, and it costs you almost nothing to notice how easily it came. In the afternoon, an email arrives asking for a small donation to a cause you barely know, and where you once would have scrolled past without a second thought. You feel a small, unmistakable pull to give, not because you are trying to prove anything to yourself or to heaven, but because something in you simply wants to say yes. In the evening, you find a few dollars in a coat pocket you had forgotten about, and instead of quietly folding it into your own wallet the way you might have done a year ago, you find yourself wanting to pass it along to someone who needs it more, and later that same night, reflecting on the day, you realize you gave 4 separate times without a single one of them feeling like a sacrifice. And Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly that a day shaped like that one is never an ordinary day at all. It is a day in which the inner state has already begun paying itself forward long before the outer account shows a single sign of it. And if you can find even one day like that in your own recent memory, one day when giving simply flowed instead of straining, treasure it, because that day was doing far more work in your favor than you were able to see at the time. Sixth, and this distinction matters more than it may first appear, because not all giving carries the same weight. There is the giving that comes from guilt, the giving that comes from obligation, the giving that comes from wanting to be seen as generous. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this kind of giving, however outwardly identical it may look, does not carry the same creative power at all, because underneath it, the state remains fear, fear of judgment, fear of appearing small, fear of not measuring up, and a gift given from fear still plants fear in the very consciousness that gave it, no matter how generous the gesture looks on the surface. So pause for a moment and consider one recent time you gave something, and ask honestly, did it come from an exhale or from a squeeze? Did it come from fullness or from the fear of looking empty. This is not a question meant to shame you. It is only meant to help you recognize the difference the next time the impulse rises, because the seventh sign is speaking specifically of the giving that comes from an exhale. The giving that surprises you with its own ease. The giving you almost cannot explain afterward, except to say it simply felt right. And when you learn to tell that giving apart from the anxious kind, you gain the ability to recognize this sign the very moment it appears in your own life, rather than months later in hindsight. So this week, without any pressure, and without turning this into another quiet transaction with heaven, simply notice, has there been a small impulse in you lately to give more freely than circumstances would seem to justify? Has a stranger's need moved you more than it used to? Has money that passed through your hands lately felt lighter, easier to release than it once did? Has generosity started to feel less like a sacrifice and more like an exhale? If so, do not talk yourself out of it as impractical, and do not shrink it down into something small and private and forgettable. Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly that this is one of the loudest signals available that your number has already been called. The coat was never really given to the stranger, and the tip was never really left for the waiter. The coat and the tip were the receipts for a supply that was already arranged behind the scenes. And I want to give you one small practice to carry this key with you. Honestly, this week, find one small moment to give something. Not out of guilt, not out of strategy, not to test whether the law will reward you for it. Just a genuine small overflow. A coffee, a kind word backed by a few dollars, a little extra where extra is not required of you. And afterward, notice carefully how it felt in your body. If it felt like loss, like a tightening, like a small ache of regret, that is simply information. Gently return to the earlier keys and let the fear loosen further before you try again. But if it felt like lightness, like something in you exhaling, like a door swinging open rather than closing, treasure that feeling and remember it, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this exact lightness is the truest currency there is, long before any dollar changes hands, and it always precedes the heavier one. It is not the size of the gift that announces the sign, it is the ease inside it, and the smaller the strain behind a gift, the larger the truth it is quietly revealing about the supply already gathering just behind it. My hand opens freely, for I already know I have more than enough to give. The eighth key is the sign that you feel called to give before the windfall shows itself in any outer form at all. And I want to draw a careful line between this key and the one just before it, because they are cousins but not twins. The seventh key was a spontaneous generosity toward whoever crosses your path, a stranger, a passerby. But the eighth key is quieter and more specific. It is a distinct inner nudge toward one particular person, one particular gift, arriving with a strange sense of timing attached to it, almost like an appointment written on your heart before it is written anywhere else. First, consider what this nudge feels like in an ordinary life. It rarely arrives dressed as inspiration. It arrives almost apologetically. A name drifting into your mind while you wash the dishes. A small ache to send flowers to someone you have not spoken to in a year. An impulse to leave an envelope on a doorstep and say nothing about it. And because it seems inconvenient, because it arrives at the exact moment you feel you have least to spare, most people wave it away as sentimentality. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly the mistake to guard against. Because the nudge was never sentimental. It was structural. It was consciousness moving ahead of the calendar to arrange its own delivery route. Second, consider the woman she described in her classes, who felt strongly, without any obvious reason, that she needed to send a small gift to a friend she had not spoken to in over a year. She almost talked herself out of it. She barely had enough to spare that month. And yet the nudge persisted so quietly and so insistently across several days that she finally obeyed it, simply to quiet her own mind. And less than 2 weeks later, that same friend, moved by the unexpected kindness, connected her to an opportunity that changed her financial circumstances entirely. And Florence Scovel Shinn wanted her students to see clearly that this was no lucky coincidence and no mechanical reward for a good deed. The very consciousness already preparing the opportunity on one side was simultaneously prompting the aligned action on the other. The nudge to give was never separate from the windfall that followed it. The nudge was the windfall's own advance messenger, moving through her as a small, persistent thought. Third, this sign asks something more active of you than almost any other on this list, because it does not simply ask you to notice a feeling, it asks you to obey one. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness communicates constantly in this hushed, unglamorous language, a name that surfaces for no clear reason, a pull toward a phone call you keep putting off, an impulse to set money aside for someone before you have any evidence they need it. And most people miss these messages because they are listening for something louder, a voice from the sky, a burning sign, when the whisper is the very medium the deeper supply most often chooses. Fourth, let me widen this with a longer story, because this sign so often gets lost among louder ones. There was a man named Arthur who told Florence Scovel Shinn that for 2 full weeks, the face of an old friend kept surfacing in his mind, at strange hours, not at any dramatic moment, simply while tying his shoes or waiting for a kettle to boil. And each time, a small specific figure came with the thought, a sum exactly enough to cover what he guessed might be a difficulty. And he argued with himself the entire 2 weeks, telling himself he was imagining a problem that did not exist, telling himself he could not afford to give away a sum like that while his own affairs were tight, and yet the thought would not release him. It returned at the kettle, it returned tying the shoes, it returned once even in the middle of a meeting where it had no business appearing. And when he finally called to simply check on his friend, he learned the man had been quietly struggling with almost that exact figure, and Arthur sent it that same afternoon, and Florence Scovel Shinn told him afterward that the 2 weeks of resistance cost him nothing eternal, because the timing was never really about the calendar date it finally happened on. It was about whether he obeyed at all, and once he obeyed, his own finances, which had felt tight and watched for weeks, loosened within days in a manner with no direct connection to the friend at all, a separate small sum arriving from an entirely unrelated source, and he said it felt less like a reward and more like a door, quietly ajar the whole time, finally allowed to swing open. Fifth, give this some texture the way an ordinary week might hold it. On a Monday, a co-worker's name crosses your mind twice for no reason you can name. By Wednesday, you still have not acted on it. By Friday, it returns a third time while you are standing in line somewhere, and this is usually the moment people explain it away, calling it nothing, imagining meaning where there is none. But Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you gently that a thought insisting on returning 3 times in 1 week has already stopped being random. It has become a message, and the old self always calculates first and obeys second if it obeys at all, while the true self obeys first and lets the calculating happen afterward, quietly, almost as an afterthought. So pause for a moment and ask honestly, has a name or a small act surfaced in your own mind more than once lately? Something you keep setting aside as impractical? If so, this key is speaking directly to you, and here is the exercise to carry into your week. When a nudge like this returns a second or third time, do not wait for it to make perfect financial sense. Do something small in its direction, a card, a message, a modest gift, an offered hour of your time. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that obedience to a small nudge is one of the highest forms of faith available to a person. It says, I trust this leading even before I can see where it is taking me. And that trust is precisely the currency the larger supply moves on. It is not the size of the gift that matters. A small gift obeyed carries more power than a large one calculated, because it proves you have begun to trust the whisper over the noise. And here is the door this key swings open into the one still ahead, because once you begin acting on these nudges consistently, something remarkable happens to your relationship with waiting itself. The anxious checking begins to fall away entirely, replaced by something steadier, and that quiet change, subtle as it is the final sign of all as avad. I obey the quiet nudge, and I trust where it is already leading me. The 9th key is the sign that a quiet certainty replaces the anxious watching, and this is the gentlest sign of them all. The one that arrives last, because it is really the summit of every sign that came before it. There is a small story Florence Scovel Shinn liked to tell, of a woman who had spent months checking her mailbox every day, with a tight, hopeful dread, opening the little metal door and finding it empty, and closing it again with the same small ache. And then one ordinary morning, she realized she had simply stopped checking, not because she had given up, but because she no longer needed the letter to arrive in order to feel that everything was already all right. And the letter came that very week, as if it had been waiting only for her to stop watching the door so anxiously. And I want you to notice how ordinary her days looked on the outside. The mailbox was the same, the street was the same, and yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that everything that mattered had already changed somewhere else entirely. In the quiet room behind her own thoughts, long before the outer world had any evidence to offer. So many people picture faith as a tense hopefulness, a hand cupped anxiously around a small flame, terrified the wind will take it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is not faith at all. It is fear wearing faith's clothing. True faith knows the flame was never in danger to begin with, so it opens its hand and lets the flame burn in the open air, undisturbed. This is why the ninth sign can look, from the outside, almost like indifference. A friend might say, "Are you not worried about this?" And you may find yourself surprised to answer honestly that you are not. Not because you have stopped caring, but because caring and anxious watching were never actually the same thing. You can care about your good arriving and still rest completely while it makes its way to you, the way a woman planting a garden cares deeply about the harvest and yet does not dig the seed back up every evening to check if it is growing. Consider your own phone for a moment. How many times a day have you opened a banking app in the last month, refreshed a screen, watching for the one notification that would finally prove your good was real? And now consider what it might feel like to simply set the phone down. Not from despair, but because something steadier has already told you what you needed to know. That shift, small as it looks, is enormous on the inside, because the last thread connecting your peace to the outer world has quietly been cut, and your peace now stands on its own, needing nothing outside itself to hold it up. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this final sign is the truest resting place of faith. It is not indifference, and it is not resignation. It is the settled knowing that the outer proof is simply running a little behind the inner truth. The way thunder always runs a little behind the lightning that caused it. The lightning has already struck long before the sound ever reaches your ears, and so it is with your good. It has already been decided in consciousness long before your eyes are given anything to see. So when you find yourself no longer straining toward the outcome, no longer needing to check and recheck, and yet somehow more certain than ever that the good is already yours, that is not you giving up. That is you finally arriving at the very state every other sign has been quietly building you toward. All the way back to the first key. The strange calm that arrived before the money did was only the first faint note of this same certainty, and now it has grown into the whole song. Your number has already been called, and this final sign is simply your own heart finally hearing it clearly, no longer through the noise of watching, but in the stillness that comes after all the watching has finally, gently, let go. I rest in quiet certainty, for my good is already settled and on its way. Here is the whole picture. It is not luck knocking on your door. It is consciousness that was already open answering when it comes. It is not the calm that follows the money. It is the calm that clears the road the money travels on. It is not other people's blessings taking anything from your own supply. It is the same river proving that it still runs. It is not the big miracle you must wait for silently. It is the small eases already arriving as its outriders. It is not begging that moves heaven. It is claiming, spoken plainly in your own voice. It is not gripping the exact how. It is releasing the map and trusting the sea. It is not the fear that must be fought. It is the fear that is simply allowed to loosen and fall away on its own. It is not generosity given for a reward. It is generosity that proves the reward was already true. It is not a windfall waiting for your obedience as payment. It is a nudge that was always its own advance messenger. And it is not anxious watching that finally brings the good home. It is quiet certainty that reveals it was already there. 9 signs, and yet only one true key beneath them all. The moment your inner state changes, the outer world simply catches up to tell you what already happened. If this teaching has stirred something true in you, I want to personally invite you into the Overflow Covenant. It is a gentle, guided path, built on these very principles, where each week you are given a new decree, a new practice, a new way of tending your consciousness, so that supply becomes your normal and not your exception. It was priced modestly, at $37, so that no sincere seeker would ever be kept out by the price of the door. And it carries a full 30-day money-back guarantee, because this is offered in faith, and it is meant to be received in faith. You will find the link in the description below this video, and I would be honored to walk this road beside you. Say it with me, one final time, in your own heart if you cannot say it aloud. I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me. And my word is my wand. Your number has already been called, and every sign along the way has simply been asking you, gently, again and again, to believe it before you see it. So go quietly now, and watch what begins to arrive.